Okay, let's get a little more serious. Journal of Creation from August 2022. So this is a year ago now, but this was only recently highlighted on their, I think it was highlighted on their webpage, but definitely on their Twitter and Facebook page with new articles and new information. So this popped up and I found it kind of interesting. Warren Shipton is now I'm trying to remember now. I looked it up. That was a few days ago. I got to write these things down because I have such horrible memory. I believe he's an engineer, though. Yeah, let me read you some portions of this article. The marring of creation and some implications for ecosystem functioning. And I was interested in this because I've been thinking a lot about, and I do think a lot about, what would the original creation have been prior to Adam mucking it up, right? Marring the creation. What would that have looked like? Like, as a biologist, I think about ecosystems. I think about ecosystem functioning. I think about genetics. I think about mutations. I think about the process of copying a cell and what happens when one copies it. How could one copy it perfectly? Is that even possible? So what does it mean to have a perfect creation? And I plan on doing a lot of talk about this in the future in separate videos. But this will give you a little tiny taste for it, because let me show you a little bit of the vision from somebody here at Creation Ministries International. God's judgment regarding human moral failure resulted in partial loss of genomic stability, replication fidelity, and soil fertility. I'm jumping in it to, I'm a couple paragraphs down. And he's been discussing, like, all right, Adam sinned. We know from the Bible that it says something about that mars the creation. Yeah, it's a big discussion about what exactly does that mean. Did it change the physical creation, beyond Adam? And even did it even change Adam in terms of a physical sense, or is it simply spiritually? Right? We're not getting into all that. We're going to go with what Answers in Creation Ministry International is doing, which is they're assuming a perfect creation, and that the way things work today is not the way things worked prior to Adam's bringing sin into the world and this corruption. So God's judgment resulted in a partial loss of genomic stability. Can't say full loss of genomic stability, or none of us would be here, right? A replication fidelity. Okay, now that goes to the genetics, all right, to the DNA stuff. Yeah, mutations started to happen. To them, no mutations prior to the fall. Genomes apparently copied themselves with 100% fidelity. Never made a mistake. And then he's skipping over to ecological thing, soil fertility. Somehow soils were completely fertile prior to Adam's sin, and then they lost fertility. They weren't as good for growing things in. Now, what would it look to have a perfect soil that doesn't lose fertility? I'm going to get myself distracted several times here, but soil fertility. So what makes soil fertile? Well, having a whole bunch of nutrients in, a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus and all the things that plants need to grow, plus plenty of aeration, oxygenated, maybe some bacteria in there, nitrogen fixers and so forth. So how would that be maintained constantly if organisms are always growing out of soil? How is that replenished? How is it recycled? In addition, there were climate and topographic changes. The climate changed after Adam sinned. Climate was different. Topographic changes? Well, it goes back to there was just rolling hills and there wasn't a lot of erosion, because if there was a lot of erosion, that would damage the soils and then the organisms couldn't grow as well. So it wouldn't be as fertile, right? So that couldn't have happened before the fall. You couldn't have had a lot of erosion. But clearly there were streams, right? But those streams must have been contained to not do much damage to the world. So just very subtle slopes, all right? So reducing the amount of erosion. Although if you I can't even say the word reduce, right? Because if I say reduce, it makes it sound like there was some erosion. Was erosion allowed at all? Could any particle move from one place to another? Doesn't that disrupt things? Oh, because the questions abound. There's so many. altered interactions between organisms, and ultimately death was experienced. Brief statements as to the nature of the changes following the fall are given in the first 9 chapters of Genesis. These alterations may be explained, at least partially, by reference to aberrations in the translation of genetic information, changes to regulatory elements, and the rare transfer of genetic information between organisms, horizontal gene transfer. This is not to discount the possibility of intelligent beings contributing to unsatisfactory outcomes. That's not to say that we also didn't mess things up even more, right? Like we are today with genetic engineering and all the things that we do that are fouling up organisms. But clearly the first 100, 200 years, we didn't do as much. But we may have tried to cross things that should have been crossed and try to manipulate organisms the way in unnatural ways. The curses pronounced on the earth led to changes in ecosystem functioning too. Population control now variously depends on predation, obligatory carnivorism, sanguivore, destructive competition, and devastation caused by diseases and pest species. Suggestions are made concerning the phenomena operating before the fall to ensure population control and ecological balance. Right? So this is essentially a portion of the abstract here. Wow. I'm intrigued. He's going to suggest how the phenomena operating before the fall ensured population control and environmental balance. Yes, I want to know that. How were environments ecologically balanced when there couldn't be like competition, there couldn't be any death, there couldn't be any loss of any different species? And yet populations were growing. Like, how do populations continue to grow and not change the environment for the other organisms? How was population, was there population control? He's suggesting there was. Populations were limited. But I mean, they were told to go forth and reproduce, right? Fill the world, fill the land. Now he's going to say later, yes, but once they start to fill the land, once they get close to having filled it, that was the end point. So the God created a beginning point where there weren't many organisms and said, now you go out and fill the world. And then, but once the world's filled, he's pretty much going to admit you can't have a world that has too many organisms or they're going to affect each other too much. And if you don't have any death, we know you're going to have like an ecological problem. It's going to be really hard to have balance. So he's going to suggest that there's natural controls that populations would have slowed down their growth and eventually stopped. And that would have been like the ultimate goal of creation, is to get to that point. And we never got there because of sin. But that's what the original plan was, to start with a few, grow it up to the amount that the world can handle that God created, and then somehow stop that population growth. Right? Somehow the command no longer is necessary at that point. Right? So, yeah, this is, I'm intrigued. What's going to happen here? The dynamics underpinning balanced ecosystem functioning are reasonably well understood today. In such systems, predatory, carnivorous activity, destructive competition, disease, crowding, and the impact of extreme environmental events are recognized as playing a significant role in population control. I totally agree. All those things are factors that affect population growth and may actually create a carrying capacity of an environment. A carrying capacity would be like, here's the total, the greatest number of organisms that of a particular species that can survive in this particular environment, given all these other things that are happening, like all this other competition or lack of resources. How population control was organized in the beginning, in the absence of these phenomena, right? There wasn't any predators, there's no carnivory, there wasn't any destructive competition. Organisms didn't compete with each other. I don't know how thousands of organisms can live in a small space and somehow not compete. I mean, one of them's going to eat that blade of grass and another one's not going to be able to eat that blade of grass. It's just like, how is that not competition? If one gets it and the other one doesn't, one gets food and the other one doesn't get food. I guess you could argue they didn't really need food, right? Because they couldn't die. right? If they can't die, then, I mean, yes, there's food, but maybe they could survive for 1,000 years without food. And they just need to eat food every once in a while. I guess that would reduce competition, right? So, okay, there's a hypothesis. I just generated a hypothesis for y'all young Earth creationists out there. Maybe you only need one meal every 10,000 years. That was enough to keep you going. And so therefore, the plants of the world could provide an immense amount of resource, for very large populations. Given the assurance that all creation is dependent on the sustenance provided at the hand of God, possible answers are provided. What are those possible answers going to be? I'm skipping through here. We're just hitting highlights of this article, so to give myself a chance to give you some ideas that I've had and things that I've been interacting with. Changes come. The scene that greeted Adam and Eve on Creation Day drew to a close was majestic and tranquil. Yeah, there's no real serious disruptions in the environment, right? Everything is quiet. It's humid. It's kind of like that quote I read earlier, that tweet, like, imagine that Noah's Ark is, it's a humid environment and the birds are singing. Since they were in a special garden, we might reference the great gardens of today's world as the lowest point in our imagination. We should not think that there was a single terrestrial ecosystem in the beginning. The earth was filled with vegetation from the third day, and a special garden was established by God. He's right? The Garden of Eden is, how would you tell the Garden of Eden was different than other places? Well, it must have had somewhat different plants, all right? It had to be different. It had to be a different ecosystem. I happen to think the Garden of Eden is distinguished by the presence of God, and that's more of, and the type of organization and who is in charge of it that makes it different than other locations. But, they're thinking very literally and physically. All right, the Garden of Eden has to have different plants or something different about it physically, besides just the presence of Adam and Eve and God. The existence of varied ecosystems might be argued to have existed from the beginning. Specialized plants capable of flourishing at different altitudes and latitudes were undoubtedly created in the beginning, as they have unique features. Well, yeah, duh. I mean, it's like, this is an admission that the North Pole and the equator, even in the original creation, would probably have some differences in terms of climate. Certainly the amount of daylight you're going to experience, the amount of sunshine, the amount of moisture. There's going to have to be some differences there. Now, most creationists downplay these differences as being minor, right? Can't have extremes, because if you have extremes, well then, are you really going to have ice caps? Are you going to have deserts? If you have those things, then you're also going to have significant weather, because those create heat and cold, which just interact in the environment. Whoa, okay, see, now here's as soon as you start thinking about this stuff, it gets all crazy, because how could you not have weather patterns? How could you not have storms, right? How is that suppressed? Which is why most creationists tend to want to try to make everything just like this warm, fuzzy globe where everything is just hot, humid, and still and stagnant, because you can't have wind and so forth. Wind might knock down trees, which might land on animals and kill them, or so you're trying to get rid of every natural force that could cause any problem. But it just makes a bland world, really, honestly. Back to this. Furthermore, if the river Euphrates, mentioned in Genesis 2:14, corresponds even remotely with the present-day river, it doesn't. Not according to all young Earth creationists I've read. They talk about there being a giant flood that covered the entire world, covering it with thousands of feet of sediments, and then eroding those sediments and having mountains formed and volcanoes and all kinds of stuff. The Middle East is nothing like the topography of the Middle East would be nothing like the topography that it is today. All right, the original created topography. So I don't even know why he's speculating about the river Euphrates here, but he's talking about like, okay, well, the Euphrates had a number of ecosystems it would have encountered over its length. Well, yes. I mean, if you have a long river, it must have started at a higher elevation. It's moving toward a more lower elevation, also latitudes. All right, maybe a higher latitude, working its way south. So you would expect some differences. The soil's got to change, right? Got to be different. The particle sizes, all right, in the sediments that are deposited by the river. Well, assuming there was erosion, right? But maybe there wasn't erosion. I mean, erosion is a breaking down of what was present in one place and moving it to another, right? It's a disruption of the original creation. This is why these types of questions, things that make you go, it's hard to make any sense of a world that is perfect, right? Which doesn't experience any change. But obviously there was change. But once there is change, how do you control that change such that it doesn't it just breaks my mind to think about what this world would have looked like. Even if this idea is disallowed, river systems require a source higher than the mouth, suggesting varied ecosystems along their course. Yeah, okay. Yep, that's great. Whoa, let's skip down to some molecular mechanisms. All right, so we've established, right, this comfy world in which, yes, he's trying to argue that there was variation. There was ecosystem variation. Different locations experienced different conditions. So there would have been different created kinds of organisms for those different environments. But they were all a perfect set for this environment, a perfect set for another environment. And I don't know what happened if the environment would have changed over time, how those animals would have still remained perfect for those environments. But maybe they had perfect amounts of variation that could be explored. But then as soon as you have variation, you have natural selection. But how does natural selection work if you don't have death? I mean, the questions abound. Yeah, but this gets better. This gets better. With snake venoms, it has been postulated, right? This is a big question all the time for creationists. Where did death-causing features come from in organisms? Because they seem really well designed, right? The venomous snakes seem super well designed to kill. And yet in that perfect world, they didn't kill. So this is the constant quest, is to find hypotheses to explain this. I like this one. This one's really fascinating to me. In snake venoms, it's been postulated that some venoms might have arisen from non-toxic genes that performed a number of cellular tasks around the body. Highly venomous snakes appear to have more copies of the venom genes than do non-venomous snakes, like pythons. Yes, this is true. I mean, this is right out of the secular literature. Venomous snakes do have more copies of the genes that make venom, right? Those genes that make enzymes that create biochemical pathways to produce the various chemicals that are the venoms, right? Snakes that are venomous have additional copies of genes that make products that make these venoms. And those are additional copies of other genes that make slightly different forms of chemicals that aren't as venomous or have different tasks in other parts of the body. So, for example, in the gut, there's a different copy of the gene expresses a protein, an enzyme into the gut lining that breaks down food. But that gene copied into the saliva produces a toxin that when a snake bites another animal, even if it's not squirting it or injecting it, maybe it just has in its saliva, it can then get that toxin into that host, right, into that other organism and kill it. Let me read on because he's going to explain this. The theory underlying this proposal suggests that the protovenom genes were first expressed at low levels in many tissues, including the oral secretory glands. And this was followed by higher expression levels for some genes in these glands and a small number of other tissues. So maybe in the original creation, there were several genes and they were expressed in like multiple different tissues, but maybe at low levels that weren't as toxic, right? The organism didn't kill itself, but it helps for maybe digestion, right? Breaking down food. And that was expressed in the saliva. And then they upregulated or caused themselves to produce more of that after Adam's sin. Somehow this changed the actual genes, right, in the snake. And now they started to make much more in their mouths. to the point where it's toxic if that were to touch other organisms. But now the highlighted blue section here. To enable these changes in the saliva, gene duplication and further mutation in one of the duplicated strands could have occurred, and exon shuffling may have also been involved. These are all things that have been shown to probably be true, right? These are all the secular explanations for the origins of venom. Right? There's a set of genes that like all snakes have, and actually several other reptiles, right? They're related to snakes. And those genes are expressed in multiple different tissues in the body, have a variety of different jobs, right? Involved in breaking things down or absorbing things. Or in defense in terms of, think of it as like immune system type responses. And so the idea is that in the snakes that become venomous, they've taken genes and they've copied those genes. So now they have 2 copies. That way they can make more of that product. And they've also maybe turned on that gene only in the mouth, and it's not turned on anywhere else. And then they have mutations, and those mutations cause those particular enzymes to make slightly different biochemical pathways, which then make even more venomous material. Right? Or they actually make a protein that is venom itself. And by tweaking that particular protein, you can make it more venomous. Then there's this whole thing about how you get in the teeth and how you end up either squirting it or injecting it. Right? And all of those are actually gene mutations on different parts of the tooth anatomy. But fascinating, all right, that I want to focus your attention again on what this author is doing. This author is saying there might have been an original gene that God made that was innocuous in terms of like it did a function that it would have done in the original Garden of Eden, right, or in the original world, in the original ecosystem, that just helped the organism eat its food, which wasn't apparently other animals because they couldn't kill other animals. So they ate plants, and somehow maybe these genes helped absorb more nutrients from that. And then after the fall, they had gene duplications, copied the genes. So now they have more copies of the genes. I would say they have more genes because after they've mutated one copy of the gene, that gene now has a new function. It makes a new product that the other gene didn't make. By the way, that's an increase of information. That's a really nice, simple example of how an organism's genome can increase the amount of total information. Not only does it have an extra gene, but it's also expressed in a different location than the other things are. So that organism is now able to do something it couldn't do before. And it did it as a result of duplication, which is itself as a mutation. And then it mutated that particular duplicate, causing it to function differently. Then he goes on to say, increase in the expression of venom genes can also be theoretically linked to suggested changes in regulatory sequences. Yes, there are sequences on around the gene where transcription factors and other regulatory proteins can influence how that gene's turned on. And like maybe it influences, it only turns on inside of a tooth cavity, right? Only inside the gums or at the base of the tooth, right? Nowhere else. Well, what does that change? What does this author think that change is? That's a mutation, right? And how does he think these mutations happened? Out of all the millions and billions of possible mutations that could happen, only certain ones are going to cause these particular actions. Were these somehow directed? Did God just like make these mutations happen? Certainly, creationists can resonate with the idea that proto-genes may have been present in the beginning where they serve useful design purposes, and that gene duplication and other targeted changes, God targeted certain sites through some unknown mechanism, or did he just do miracles, like a whole bunch of individual miracles, change that base to that, change that base to, and that promoter so that now that gene gets turned on a different location. Let me copy this piece of DNA and put another piece over here. Was that a miracle or somehow a natural process that occurred doing that? That gene duplication and other targeted sequence changes occurred following the curse. So somehow Adam sinned, and that caused a gene duplication. And that gene duplication then had a bunch of targeted mutations such that those mutations were only expressed in particular tissues in the mouth of a snake so that they could make venom, so that they could kill. So that allows them to function in this new altered ecosystem where apparently they didn't have any plants to eat, so they had to start eating animals. All right. And yet all this is not the original design, and yet it was the original design. That's the kooky thing that's the hard thing to grasp, is this is still designed because it's targeted and it's a plan, but that's not the original plan, in creation. Okay, we got two more slides. All right, going on with some other molecular mechanisms. Other organisms can be involved in gene transfer. For example, the transfer of DNA between a bacterium and a yeast has been recorded in culture. And I've done a whole video on an entire group of genes that has been moved from one bacteria into a group of yeast. And that yeast, and it's not this particular example, by the way, that yeast then has an entire metabolic pathway that it didn't have before. And so it can produce a product that helps it get scavenge iron from its environment that no other type of fungi can do. Only this one particular group. And that group clearly got that group of genes from other bacteria. That's horizontal gene transfer, transferring from one type of organism to another, right? Such that there's a new property in the genome of that fungus now. I think that's another pretty clear example of a change in the amount of, I hate the word information, but I know young earth creationists use it all the time, so I'll use it here. A change in the amount of information available to that particular organism. It's conceivable that related events could occur in natural situations such as biofilms. Where there's organisms that are interacting with each other, maybe they could transfer genes from one to another. And then there's this great line, right? It's like, here this author is suggesting a bunch of what any evolutionary biologist has already suggested as ways that organisms adapt and change and actually gain new characteristics, right? New traits. Venom is a new trait compared to non-venomous snakes. And how do they become venomous? By taking genes that were already in the non-venomous snake, duplicating them, and adapting them for the venomous characteristic. All right, but so it's like he knows that he's like pretty close to like accepting an awful lot of evolution. And if he was writing for Answers in Genesis, this would be a little scary because he might be called a young earth evolutionist by Ken Ham and others. So got to throw in this caveat. It is important to note that the organism receiving the new information is still abundantly recognizable and is not transformed into something different. It's not a new kind. It's just gotten a new characteristic, but it's still clearly a fungus, right? And it's clearly still Saccharomyces. Evolution as viewed by modern science is not illustrated in these examples. Okay. Okay, I know this sounded like evolution, especially since this is the actual evolutionist explanation for how snakes became venomous and how different venomous species can be understood and why we can actually understand why they have different venoms, because they've altered those particular duplicated genes in different ways. But no. That is not evolution, even though I just completely absconded with the evolutionary explanation, because that's not molecules becoming man, right? That's just a shift and change in the characteristics of a particular kind, right? But it's still gaining new characteristics, right? Clearly is. He's admitting that venomous snakes have changed and come from non-venomous snakes, and that they have actual genes that they didn't have originally, right? Because they've duplicated them. Several options have been outlined by John Morris, grandfather of, we'll say, modern creationism. Namely, features were present originally, maybe benign, that would later be needed. The genome contained the potential to be changed by the forces of nature and by selection to give rise to carnivory, organisms designed to suit environmental conditions as a function of survivability, or the sinister forces of evil led by Lucifer were somehow involved. Like maybe maybe Satan himself actually has the tools to be able to genetically engineer things. Like God's given him the ability to go in and tinker with our genomes. Like maybe Satan actually causes mutations. Like is going in there and saying, mutate this, mutate this, mutate this, duplicate this gene, make it mutate so that this thing can make venom now, which then will be dangerous to human beings. So it's a way of attacking people. I wasn't successful with Adam in terms of I was very successful with Adam, but he was given a promise to eventually, give rise to a savior. But I'm still going to muck around with human beings by altering the organisms around them so that his life will be very difficult. And maybe that's part of God's curse, right? God cursed the land and cursed the ground, cursed all these animals. And part of that curse is allowing Satan to do that work. Kind of like in Job, where maybe there was a conversation and Satan comes to God and says, I'll bet that if you allow me to, mess around with nature and make it really unpalatable and make it difficult for man to live, that they won't actually seek you out. And God says, challenge accepted, but I'm still going to bring those who are mine to me. Whew. Wow, I'm going down some interesting tangents today. In the study of ecosystems of isolated islands devoid of mammal predators, a situation is observed somewhat resembling the stability envisioned in the beginning. I don't think it's somewhat resembling at all, right? He's going to say that, hey, look, there's some islands where there are no predators. And in that situation, there is something that they kind of stabilize their populations. And that's kind of like it was in the beginning. It's nothing like it was in the beginning. There was no death, according to young earth creationists, in the beginning. That population didn't stabilize in any form or fashion in the same way that it would now. There's so many different ecosystem rules that organisms are obeying today that are the outcomes of organisms competing with one another, right? And natural selection and mutations happening and all of that, right? None of that is he's said at the very beginning, doesn't occur. It didn't occur in the original creation. In such situations, mammalian predatory activity is unnecessary for the maintenance of population balance. It is true that in some of these situations, losses and gains of species may be experienced due to the pressures of food supply or to predation by invertebrates. But a dynamic equilibrium occurs over time. Yeah, so he just turns right around and admits that, yeah, there could be pressures due to food supply, right? But I know he's not going to say that in the original creation there was a problem with food supply and therefore organisms couldn't survive, right? Or they didn't have to compete with one another, right? Well-balanced components of vegetation were established initially to cover the earth, with the planned starting fauna added later. Now he's going to appeal to the fact that God created all the plants first, and then he placed animals there, and all the plants were ready. And so the fauna seeded right into the existing ecosystems were meant to multiply, meaning there would have to be a succession as they spread throughout the terrain. Finally, a homeostatic state would have been reached in the absence of mammalian predators. A homeostatic state via what mechanism? Tell me about the mechanisms here. How did a homeostatic state arrive? I mean, if all those organisms are multiplying and they've been told to fill the world and they start copying each other, how do you reach homeostasis? I'd really like to know that. Once the state had been attained, that its continuance would have been dependent on population control. Well, heck yes, right? If populations are continuing to grow, there's going to be competition. There's going to be natural selection. There's going to be, if there are no mutations, there's no variation in the population. They're all just replicating clones of themselves, but eventually they're just bumping into each other. And I don't even know if the grass can grow at some point if you have so many animals pushing up against each other that the sun can't hit the ground. But he's saying there's population control. The actual number of offspring produced, fertility, and natural ability to reproduce, fecundity, has profound effects on the survival of plants and animals. Yes, yeah, absolutely. In the beginning, these features were designed to enable population increase to occur in planned manner through the various ecosystems existing. Somehow there was a plan. Here's the number of animals, and they will grow at a certain rate given the amount of material been provided for them in the original creation. In the beginning, as can be anticipated, there were multiple dispersal centers representing different ecosystems that were seeded with animals, birds, and other life forms at creation. Multiplication was mandated, remember. This would have ensured the functioning of the ecosystem moving forward to a planned final state. I found this interesting. I rarely, if ever, hear any young earth creationists talk about this. So there was a beginning state that was not the final state, right? There was a beginning state that was not meant to stay exactly as it is, hence the command to fill, right? To multiply. But so that implies then that there is a final state. So now he takes this, like there's an initial state and there's a final state, and then there's something that happens in between, right? Nevertheless, in order to reach this state, a succession conceivably occurred as the creature spread out and occupied virgin vegetated terrain. There's animals, they're reproducing, they're meeting new area. They're not only just reproducing one area, but they're expanding, right? Geographically. And they have more things to eat. So I guess there's so much food they don't have to compete with each other. At some point, reproductive activity in the fauna would necessarily have to have been slowed to achieve the balance planned. So God had a plan for the number total that there would be eventually. So the initial state, they're told to multiply, but nearer to the final state, apparently that command must be taken back, or would have been taken back, planned, and then terminated, as with no death as an option in feeling organisms. That's a really important phrase there, feeling organisms. This is the creationist way of saying that insects could have died, maybe even, a lot of small ocean critters could have died, worms could have died, and so forth. It's only maybe vertebrates, right, that didn't die, which creates a whole other set of really complicated things to think about, like how you could have a complete ecosystem of organisms that are dying and decomposing and regenerating and competing with each other. And obviously natural selection must be happening. Like, how do you not have natural selection happening? How would you stop that? All right. And that's happening with like 75% or 90% of all the organisms on Earth. There are things that we kind of think of as alive from a scientific sense. And then there's these vertebrate organisms that are operating on a completely different form of biology. No competition. They can't, right? There's no natural selection. They can't die, right? So what controls their populations, and how would they end? How would they stop growing? All of those are like really weird questions when the rest of the world is behaving in some way that like it does today. Substantial changes in the physical environment, either seasonally or with the passage of time, are not thought to have occurred. He's saying like, well, we don't think there was really seasons, and there wasn't huge changes in the ecology. So therefore, what was it? How are these organisms? How are they held at bay? And his solution is that somehow they are brought into balance where they weren't able to multiply anymore. And they just reached a happy medium. The grass grows this fast, and the sheep keep eating it. Grass continues to grow, sheep keep eating it, but there aren't any more sheep. So therefore, it can get into some kind of homeostatic situation. Except that all the other organisms, what stops fungi and bacteria and insects from continuing to replicate and then consuming all the material? Right? They're competing with each other. They could create huge shifts and changes in the ecology, since they're not operating by the same rules that vertebrates are. All right, this is been going on. This is a long time now. Sorry, I'm over an hour. That's it. Thanks a lot. Talk to you later.